The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, heavier than any physical blow. Honestly, Mom, he'd sighed, dragging the back of his hand across his forehead, as if the very sight of me caused him physical pain. It's just embarrassing. The way you talk, the things you do, it's just not sophisticated. Not the kind of thing you want around people who matter. We were at the company picnic, his company, a forced smile plastered on my face, while I made polite conversation with a woman who smelled faintly of expensive perfume and condescension. He'd pulled me aside, ostensibly to introduce me to someone important, but instead delivered this quiet, devastating verdict. My son, my only child, the boy I'd poured my entire being into, raising, sacrificing dreams I'd barely allowed myself to name, had just called me an embarrassment. His wife, Sarah, stood a little distance away, a cool, knowing smile playing on her lips, her eyes fixed on me with a peculiar, almost triumphant glint. She'd always been subtly undermining, a master of the passive-aggressive suggestion, the well-timed sigh, the gentle correction of my less-than-polished ways. But this felt like the culmination of years of their combined efforts to shrink me, to make me feel small and insignificant, a relic from a past he'd rather forget. The afternoon sun felt suddenly harsh, the cheerful chatter of colleagues and their families sounding like nails on a chalkboard. I remember nodding, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. My throat tight, my heart a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I managed some non-committal sound, something like "oh" or "I see," my voice thin and reedy, utterly failing to convey the seismic shift happening inside me. It wasn't just the words themselves, cruel though they were. It was the context, the casual dismissal, the implication that my very existence was a stain on his carefully curated life, a life built on the polished surfaces and strategic alliances he and Sarah cultivated with such ruthless efficiency. He was on the rise at Sterling and Shaw, a firm known for its old money roots and cutthroat corporate culture. He'd worked hard, yes, but Sarah's networking, her effortless navigation of the social currents that apparently mattered just as much as quarterly reports, had been a significant factor in his rapid ascent. And I was the humble mother who had packed his lunches, stayed up late helping with homework, cheered him on at soccer games, and generally faded into the background of his adult life, trotted out only for obligatory holidays or apparently embarrassing public appearances. I looked around at the impeccably dressed couples, the well-behaved children, the catered spread that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and for a fleeting awful second, I saw myself through his eyes, a frumpy middle-aged woman, out of place, a little clumsy with her words, a potential liability. The feeling was so sharp, so intensely painful, it took my breath away. But then something else stirred beneath the pain. A flicker of something hot and unfamiliar. It wasn't anger? Not exactly. Not yet. It was more like a sudden, fierce clarity. A realization that the quiet life I'd built, the one where I prioritized his needs, his happiness, his perception of me, had led me here, to this moment of utter humiliation. He didn't see the years of selfless devotion, the sleepless nights when he was sick, the sacrifices I'd made for his education, for his future. He saw an impediment, a social albatross, and in that moment, standing there under the indifferent sky, surrounded by strangers who suddenly felt like witnesses to my shame, I knew something had to change. It wouldn't be a dramatic outburst, a tearful confrontation. That wasn't my way. My way was quieter, more deliberate, a slow burn. The seed of an idea, tiny and barely formed, began to take root in the desolate landscape of my humiliation. It was a dangerous seed, perhaps, one that promised a harvest of complicated emotions, but in that instant it was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that offered a path forward from the suffocating weight of his contempt. I managed to excuse myself, muttering something about needing to find the restroom, and walked away, my back straight, my gaze fixed somewhere beyond the manicured lawn, beyond the laughing crowds, beyond my son and his perfect, judgmental wife. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The image of his disappointed sigh, Sarah's cool smile, was already etched onto my soul. a brand mark that would fuel the long, arduous journey I was about to undertake. The road ahead was uncertain, daunting, and I had no idea if I possessed the strength to walk it. But the alternative, remaining the embarrassing mother, the woman to be hidden away, was simply unthinkable. The quiet strength that had seen me through other difficult times, the resilience I hadn't realized I possessed until it was tested, began to gather itself, preparing for a fight I hadn't known I needed to wage. It wasn't against him, not really. It was for myself, to prove, not to him, but to the woman I saw reflected in the sudden fierce resolve in my own eyes, that I was far more than an embarrassment. The drive home was silent, the radio off, the passing scenery a blur of indifferent greens and grays. The words looped in my mind, a cruel, relentless soundtrack. It's just embarrassing. Over and over. I pulled into my driveway, the familiar little house looking both comforting and suddenly oppressive. It was the house he'd grown up in, the house where I'd nurtured him, the walls echoing with 1,000 memories, most of them centered around him. Now it felt less like a home, and more like a museum of a life that was apparently not good enough. I walked inside, the air cool and still after the humid afternoon. I went straight to the small den, a room filled with books and photographs. My fingers traced the spines of worn volumes, paused on framed pictures. Him as a baby, a toddler, a grinning boy with a missing tooth, a self-conscious teenager in a graduation cap. Each image was a sharp, physical ache. How could the boy in those photos grow into the man who could say such a thing? Had I been blind? Had I missed the signs of his growing detachment, his subtle disdain? Or had it been nurtured by external forces, by the world he now inhabited? A world where authenticity was less valued than polish, where your mother could be a liability if she didn't fit the mold. I sank into the old armchair, the one he used to curl up in with a book. The scent of dust and aged paper filled the air. I thought about his father, my ex-husband, Mark. He'd left years ago for a younger, more dynamic woman, someone who apparently better reflected the image he wanted to project. He'd been subtly dismissive of me too, in his own way during the later years of our marriage, suggesting I was too quiet, too domestic, lacking ambition. Funny how those words hadn't cut quite as deeply then, maybe because I still had my son's unwavering affection. Now stripped of that, the echoes of Mark's judgment felt almost prescient. Had I allowed myself to be defined by others for too long, first by my husband, then by my son, the quiet life I'd chosen, the focus on raising a good person, seemed to have resulted in a good person who found his own mother embarrassing. The irony was a bitter pill. For years I had put my own aspirations on hold. Not entirely, but significantly. I had a degree, a good one, in business administration. I'd worked for a few years before he was born, enjoyed the challenge, the structure, the sense of competence it gave me. But motherhood had been my primary focus, a demanding, all-consuming role I'd embraced wholeheartedly. I didn't regret the time spent with him, not for a second. The laughter, the late-night talks, the simple joy of watching him grow, those were treasures. But at what cost? Had I lost myself in the process? Had I become so focused on nurturing him that I had let my own light dim, making myself invisible, easy to dismiss, even by him? A deep sadness washed over me, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just about the embarrassment. It was about feeling erased, irrelevant. My purpose, it seemed, had run its course, and I was left with the wreckage of a relationship I had built on unconditional love, only to find it conditional after all. But beneath the sadness, the flicker from the company picnic began to grow stronger, warmer. It wasn't just about feeling hurt anymore. It was about a quiet, burning need to reclaim something that had been lost, something I hadn't even realized was missing until his words exposed the gaping void. It wasn't about proving him wrong, not primarily. It was about proving something to myself, that I was capable, intelligent, resilient, that I was still me, the woman who had dreams and ambitions however long they'd been dormant. The idea, still nebulous, began to take a more defined shape. It involved his world, the world of Sterling and Shaw, the world where I was deemed unfit. If I was an embarrassment in that world, then perhaps I needed to conquer it. Not for him, but for me. To walk into that world on my own terms. Not as a guest, not as a mother tagging along, but as someone who belonged, who commanded respect. The task felt monumental, almost absurd. I was middle-aged, out of the workforce for decades, my skills rusty, my network non-existent. How could I possibly compete in the cutthroat world of corporate finance? It seemed impossible, and yet the alternative, living with the constant sting of his judgment, the quiet erosion of my self-worth, felt even more impossible to bear. This was a fight for my dignity, for my identity, and I realized, with a quiet certainty that surprised me, ready to fight. The tears that had threatened at the picnic finally came, silent and hot, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release, of a dormant spirit awakening, of a quiet resolve hardening into steel. The journey would be long, difficult, and lonely, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose, however daunting. The first step, I decided, wiping my eyes with a steady hand, would be to update my resume. It had been gathering dust in a drawer for 20 years. It was time to blow that dust off and see what remained. The old resume was pathetic. A single page listing jobs from a lifetime ago. Skills that were probably obsolete. Business administration degree, minor in finance. A few years at a small consulting firm before I left to have him. It felt like reading the obituary of a life that had ended before it truly began. I stared at it, a wave of doubt washing over me. What was I thinking? Re-entering the workforce at my age, with this history, into a field that had undoubtedly changed beyond recognition. It was folly. The logical part of my brain screamed surrender. But the other part, the one fueled by the lingering sting of his words and the quiet burning need for reclamation, pushed back. It wasn't about being logical. It was about being driven. I started with research, hours spent online, poring over industry websites, job boards, articles about the current landscape of finance and consulting. So much had changed. New technologies, new regulations, new jargon. It was overwhelming. I felt like a relic from another era, trying to decipher a foreign language. But I was determined. I dusted off old textbooks, ordered new ones online, signed up for free online courses in financial modeling and data analytics. My evenings were no longer filled with quiet television or reading for pleasure. They were filled with studying, with grappling with complex concepts, with the frustrating process of learning new software. My brain, dormant for so long in this capacity, felt stiff and resistant at first, like an old engine sputtering to life. There were moments of despair, of wanting to give up. The material was challenging, the hours long, and the loneliness of my endeavor was a constant companion. I couldn't talk to my son about it, obviously. My friends, lovely as they were settled in their own routines, their lives centered around retirement or grandchildren. This was my battle, and I had to fight it alone. I set up a small desk in the corner of the den, the one where his baby photos smiled down at me. It was a constant, ironic reminder of why I was doing this. Each complex formula I mastered, each new software function I understood, felt like a small victory, a quiet act of defiance against the label he had given me. I updated my LinkedIn profile, a daunting task in itself. Listing homemaker or mother didn't exactly scream corporate powerhouse. I had to reframe my experiences, highlight transferable skills, project management, running a household, raising a child, budgeting, negotiation, convincing a teenager to clean his room, buying a used car. It felt a little like fiction writing, but there was truth in it. I had managed, organized, problem-solved for decades. These were skills, even if they weren't listed on a traditional corporate ladder. I reached out to a few old contacts from my brief career, tentative emails sent into the void. Most didn't reply. A few offered polite, lukewarm responses. One, however, a woman named Carol, I'd worked closely with, replied with genuine warmth. She was still in the industry, higher up now, and offered to meet for coffee. Meeting Carol was a turning point. She didn't pity me or dismiss me. She saw the fire in my eyes, the determination. She listened patiently as I explained, skirting around the personal reasons, focusing on my desire to re-engage, to contribute. She gave me invaluable advice, updated me on the industry landscape, and most importantly, didn't laugh when I told her my audacious goal, to work at Sterling and Shaw. Tough firm, she'd said, stirring her coffee. Very traditional, very competitive, and they value pedigree. But she looked at me directly, her eyes sharp and intelligent. You were always smart, always had a good head for strategy. It won't be easy, but it might not be impossible. Her words were a lifeline. She didn't have any openings herself, but she knew people. She promised to keep an ear out, to make a few introductions. I left that coffee shop feeling lighter, more hopeful than I had in months. The task still felt enormous, but it no longer felt entirely insurmountable. The quiet planning continued, meticulous and focused. I identified the specific departments within Sterling and Shaw that aligned, however loosely, with my background. I analyzed their leadership structure, their recent projects. I was a ghost in their corporate world, observing, learning, strategizing. My son, meanwhile, seemed oblivious. Our conversations were brief, strained. He'd call occasionally, usually to ask for something or to complain about work. He never asked about me, about how I was spending my days. He didn't know about the stacks of textbooks, the late-night study sessions, the quiet, burning ambition that now consumed me. He still saw me as the embarrassing mother, probably assuming I was filling my days with mundane activities, and I let him. My silence was my shield, and soon, it would be my weapon. The gap between his perception of me and the reality of what I was building was widening, creating a space where my quiet transformation could flourish, hidden from his dismissive gaze. Carol's introductions led to tentative conversations, informational interviews that felt more like auditions. I met with people who were polite, but clearly skeptical, their eyes subtly scanning my dated resume, mentally calculating the years I'd been out of the game. It was demoralizing. I felt the familiar sting of being underestimated, dismissed before I even had a chance to prove myself. But each rejection, each lukewarm response, only solidified my resolve. It wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about challenging the assumptions, the unspoken rules that seemed to govern who was allowed in this world. One of the introductions Carol facilitated was to a headhunter specializing in placing senior executives. His name was Mr. Davison, a man with shrewd eyes and an air of perpetual haste. Our first meeting was brief, and to the point. He reviewed my history, raised an eyebrow at the gap years, and candidly told me how difficult it would be. The market is tough, he'd said, tapping a pen on my resume. And frankly, your profile, it's a hard sell for the level you seem to be targeting, especially at a firm like Sterling and Shaw. They typically look for a very specific trajectory. He didn't call me embarrassing, but the implication was clear. I didn't fit the mold. What level are you targeting? He'd asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. I took a deep breath. A senior leadership role, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Something where I can leverage strategic thinking, management experience, and a deep understanding of organizational dynamics. I didn't mention the organizational dynamics of managing a complex family life, but it was there, woven into the fabric of my experience. He leaned back in his chair, regarding me with a mixture of surprise and what looked like reluctant respect. Ambitious, he'd conceded. Given the circumstances, I smiled faintly. I'm a quick study, Mr. Davison, and I'm highly motivated. I didn't elaborate on the source of that motivation. He agreed to keep me in mind, file my resume, the professional equivalent of a polite dismissal. But something must have stuck. A few weeks later, he called. Not with a job offer, but with a suggestion. There's a mid-level position at a smaller firm, he said. It's not Sterling and Shaw, Not senior leadership, but it's a foot in the door. It would give you current experience. Update your resume. It could be a stepping stone. It was an operations manager role at a financial tech startup, a chaotic, fast-paced environment, a world away from the quiet rhythm of my home. It paid significantly less than the senior roles I was targeting, and the responsibilities felt frankly beneath my capabilities, even after 2 decades out. But it was an opportunity, a chance to prove myself, to shake off the rust, to demonstrate that I wasn't just living in the past. It was a chance to stop being the embarrassing mother and start being a professional again. I took it. The first few months were brutal. The technology was new, the culture was alien, and the expectations were high. I was often the oldest person in the room, surrounded by young, hyper-connected colleagues who seemed to effortlessly navigate the digital landscape. I made mistakes, fumbled with software, felt the sting of impatient sighs from colleagues young enough to be my children. There were moments I wanted to walk out, to retreat to the quiet safety of my house, to accept that maybe I just wasn't cut out for this anymore. But then I would remember his face, his sigh, Sarah's smile, and I would push through. I stayed late, asked questions, practiced relentlessly. I used the quiet strength I'd cultivated over years of putting others first, channeling it inward, using it to fuel my own growth. I applied the strategic thinking I'd used to manage a household budget and schedule to streamlining office processes. I used the negotiation skills I'd honed on a stubborn teenager to navigate difficult conversations with vendors. Slowly, painstakingly, I found my footing. I started anticipating problems, proposing solutions, earning the respect of my colleagues and superiors, not because of my age or my past, but because of my competence and dedication. The chaos of the startup environment, initially overwhelming, became a forge, shaping me, hardening my resolve, refining my skills. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't the corner office at Sterling & Shore, but it was progress. Tangible, undeniable progress. My son mentioned my new job only once, dismissively. "Oh, Mom's working again," he'd told Sarah over the phone when they called for a perfunctory chat. "Some small tech company, must be nice to keep busy." His tone suggested a hobby, a way to fill the empty hours, not a serious career move. It was another quiet cut, another reminder of how little he understood, or perhaps how little he wanted to understand, the person I was becoming. But his lack of interest was also a form of protection, a shield behind which I could continue to build, hidden from his view, gaining strength for the moment when our paths would inevitably intersect again. This time on my terms. The small tech company proved to be an invaluable training ground. I devoured everything I could learn, not just about operations, but about the broader financial tech industry, market trends, corporate strategy. I sought out mentors, attended industry events, building a new network from scratch. I discovered a passion for the strategic side of the business, the challenge of analyzing complex problems and developing innovative solutions. My mind, which I had feared had atrophied, felt sharper, more agile than ever before. I excelled in my role, streamlining processes, increasing efficiency, contributing to the company's bottom line in tangible ways. My manager, a bright, ambitious woman named Anya, recognized my potential. She gave me more responsibility, championed my ideas, and encouraged me to aim higher. She didn't see my age as a barrier, but as a source of experience and perspective. It was a refreshing change from the subtle skepticism I'd encountered elsewhere. After 2 years at the startup, I knew I was ready for the next step. I had updated my skills, proven my capability in a modern corporate environment, and built a solid track record. The image of Sterling & Shaw, the gleaming towers downtown, remained my ultimate target. Mr. Davison, the headhunter, called again. He'd been tracking my progress at the startup. "Impressive," he conceded during our call. "You've done well there. Really exceeded expectations. From what I hear." His tone was different this time, less skeptical, more curious. "You're getting noticed." He mentioned a few potential opportunities. Larger companies, more senior roles than my current one. but none were Sterling and Shaw. I reiterated my focus. Sterling and Shaw, Mr. Davison, I said firmly. That's where I want to be. He paused. Still aiming high, I see. They just had a major shakeup in their executive team. Retirement, internal reshuffling. Created some openings, competitive of course. My heart leaped. This was it? The window of opportunity I had been waiting for, quietly preparing for years. Are they looking for external candidates for any of the senior roles? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Possibly, he said. They're notoriously insular. Promote from within, where possible. But with this many changes, they might be looking for some fresh perspective. At the top, there's a senior vice president role open in corporate strategy. Reports directly to the COO. Requires extensive experience in strategic planning, market analysis, leading large teams, the kind of profile I mentioned before. He didn't need to finish. It was the perfect fit for the skills I had been diligently acquiring and refining. It was also exactly the level of leadership I needed to be at to potentially intersect with my son's chain of command. Are you interested in that role? He asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. He likely still saw me as a long shot, an anomaly. Very interested, Mr. Davison, I said, extremely interested. He explained the process. It would be rigorous. Multiple rounds of interviews, assessments, background checks. I would be competing against seasoned executives with decades of uninterrupted experience at prestigious firms. The odds were stacked against me, but I had come too far to be intimidated. The sting of his words, though less raw now, still served as a powerful motivator. I spent weeks preparing. I researched Sterling and Shaw even more deeply, analyzing their financial statements, their market position, their announced strategic priorities. I practiced interview questions, honing my responses, crafting a narrative that highlighted my unique journey and the valuable perspective it brought. I worked with Anya, who generously offered her time to run mock interviews and provide feedback. She was a valuable ally, seeing my ambition not as a threat, but as something to be admired. My son remained oblivious. He was focused on his own career trajectory, complaining about his boss, a man named David Miller, apparently a rising star at Sterling and Shaw, known for being demanding and results-oriented. It was ironic, hearing him talk about his professional challenges, completely unaware that I was quietly preparing to enter his corporate ecosystem at a level far above his own, potentially even above his boss's. The anticipation was a tense coil in my stomach. This wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about validation, about reclaiming my narrative, about proving that the embarrassing mother was a force to be reckoned with. The interviews began. They were challenging, intense, forcing me to draw on every ounce of my knowledge and experience. I faced tough questions about my career gap, my transition, my ability to lead at a senior level in a large traditional organization. But I was ready. I answered honestly, confidently, weaving my story into a compelling case for why my unique background was an asset, not a liability. I didn't try to hide my past. I reframed it, highlighting the resilience, the adaptability, the strategic thinking required to navigate complex, long-term challenges, both personal and professional. With each successful round, my confidence grew. I wasn't just performing, I was owning my story, standing in my truth, and it felt incredibly empowering. The final interview was with the CEO himself, a formidable woman known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach. It was the most challenging interview of my life, but also the most exhilarating. I felt completely present, focused, and in control. As I left the Sterling and Shaw offices that day, walking through the imposing lobby, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Regardless of the outcome, I had made it this far. I had competed at the highest level. I was no longer the invisible woman, the embarrassing mother. I was a contender. The waiting period was agonizing. Every phone call made my heart jump. My son continued his unaware complaints about David Miller, his boss, about the pressures of working at Sterling and Shaw. I listened, a strange mix of empathy and detached amusement swirling within me. He had no idea how close I was to entering his world, not as a guest, but as a player. The call from Mr. Davison came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk at the startup, ostensibly working, but my mind was a million miles away. "They want you," he said, his voice devoid of his usual haste, almost reverent. "Sterling and Shaw, Senior Vice President, Corporate Strategy. They want you." The words hung in the air, echoing the earlier words that had set me on this path. But this time, the feeling was one of pure, unadulterated triumph. It wasn't a shout of victory, but a quiet, deep resonance, vibrating through every cell in my body. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the reality sink in. Sterling and Shaw, Senior Vice President. It was done. The impossible had become possible. The journey, the years of quiet study, the challenging startup job, the relentless preparation had led to this moment. It wasn't just about the job title, the salary, the prestige. It was about the culmination of a deeply personal quest. It was about reclaiming my identity, proving my worth, not just to myself, but in the very arena where I had been dismissed, where my son felt I was an embarrassment. The irony was a potent, intoxicating sensation. I was not just entering his world, I was entering it at a level that commanded respect, a level where his boss's boss would report to me. Mr. Davison continued, detailing the offer, the salary, the benefits, the start date. It was a package far exceeding my expectations, a clear reflection of the value they saw in me, a value my son had been blind to. I listened, nodded, asked clarifying questions, handling the negotiation with a calm competence that years of practice had instilled. When I hung up the phone, a wave of emotion washed over me. It wasn't just joy, it was a complex mix of elation, vindication, and a strange, lingering sadness. This victory, hard-won and sweet, was also a stark reminder of the pain that had fueled it. My son's words had been a catalyst. Yes, but they were also a wound that might never fully heal. How would he react? How would Sarah react? The thought of their faces when they found out sent a jolt of something akin to fear, but also anticipation through me. I wasn't planning a dramatic reveal, a moment designed solely for his humiliation. That wasn't my objective. My objective had been self-reclamation. But the inevitability of the reveal, the unavoidable collision of our separate worlds, was now a tangible reality. I spent the next few days wrapping things up at the startup, notifying Anya and my colleagues. They were genuinely happy for me, impressed by the leap to Sterling and Shaw. Anya hugged me, telling me I deserved it, that I was an inspiration. Her words so different from the dismissive tones I had become accustomed to in my personal life were a balm to my soul. I signed the offer letter in my den, sitting at the small desk I had set up for my studies, the one with his childhood photos surrounding me. It felt symbolic. The contract, the tangible proof of my hard-fought success, signed in the space where the pain of his words had first spurred me to action, where the quiet planning had begun. I looked at the photos, his innocent smile, his bright, trusting eyes. It was hard to reconcile that image with the man who found me embarrassing. Had he changed so much? Or had I simply never truly seen him, blinded by my own unconditional love? I placed the signed contract carefully into a folder bearing the Sterling and Shaw logo, a sleek silver emblem that now represented not just a company but a profound personal victory. The house felt different now, less like a museum of a past life, more like a launch pad for a powerful future. It was still filled with memories, but they no longer held me captive. I was no longer defined by the life lived within these walls, by the roles I had played here. I was stepping out, carrying the quiet strength built within these walls, into a new, challenging arena. The tension mounted as my start date approached. I hadn't told my son yet. I wasn't sure how I would do it, or when. Part of me dreaded the conversation, the potential for further conflict, further pain. Another part, the part that was now infused with a quiet confidence, looked forward to the moment when his perception of me would be irrevocably shattered, replaced by a reality he couldn't dismiss. The woman he found embarrassing was about to become a significant figure in his professional world. The inversion of power was complete. The wait was almost over. My first day at Sterling & Shaw was a blur of meetings, introductions, and navigating the sprawling, impersonal corporate environment. The offices were as imposing as the lobby, all glass, steel, and hushed efficiency. My new office was on a high floor, with a stunning view of the city skyline. It was spacious, tastefully furnished, a stark contrast to the cramped corner of my den where this journey had begun. A quiet symbol of how far I had come. My assistant, a cheerful young woman named Chloe, helped me settle in, explaining the systems, the protocols, the unwritten rules of the firm. Everyone I met was professional, polite, and seemed genuinely interested in my background and my vision for the corporate strategy department. It was a world away from the casual dismissal I'd experienced at the company picnic. Here, I was respected for my mind, my experience, my potential contribution. The irony of being here, in the heart of the institution where I had been deemed an outsider, was a constant internal hum. My son worked somewhere in this very building, on a lower floor, in a different department. His boss, David Miller, the man he frequently complained about, would soon be reporting indirectly to me through his direct manager, who would report to me as Senior VP. The hierarchy was clear, the lines of authority undeniable. I hadn't planned the reveal. I had wrestled with how and when to tell him, imagining different scenarios, none of them feeling quite right. A formal announcement felt too deliberate, too much like rubbing salt in a wound. A casual mention felt impossible for something so significant. Ultimately, fate, or perhaps a touch of dramatic irony, intervened. About a week into my new role, I was scheduled to attend a cross-departmental strategy meeting. These meetings involved representatives from various divisions, including some lower-level managers presenting updates from their teams. As I walked into the conference room, following Chloe, I scanned the faces around the large table, and then I saw him. My son. He was sitting towards the back, next to a man I recognized from his descriptions as David Miller, his boss. My son looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw me, his face drained of color, his jaw slackened. He looked like he had seen a ghost. The murmurs around the table subsided as everyone turned to see who had captured his attention. David Miller followed his gaze, his own expression shifting from professional curiosity to stunned recognition as he looked at me, then back at my son, a question forming on his lips. Chloe introduced me. "Everyone, this is our new Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy, my name." The titles spoken aloud in that room hung in the sudden silence like a thunderclap. My son didn't move, didn't speak. David Miller, however, recovered quickly, though his eyes still held a flicker of shock. He stood up, extending a hand. "Welcome, my name. We've heard a lot about you. Looking forward to working together." He glanced pointedly at my son, a silent question passing between them. I shook his hand, offering a polite, professional smile. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I've heard some things about your team as well. Looking forward to getting acquainted with everyone." My gaze flickered to my son, who still hadn't moved. Our eyes met across the table. In his I saw shock, confusion, and a dawning comprehension of the impossible reality unfolding before him. There was no longer any room for dismissal, for condescension, for calling me embarrassing. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted completely. He was a junior manager in a room where I held a senior leadership position, where his own boss was welcoming me as his superior. I took my seat at the head of the table, the designated place for the senior executive leading the meeting. As I settled in, arranging my notes, I could feel his eyes on me, heavy with disbelief. I didn't dwell on his reaction. This wasn't about him, not in that moment. It was about being here in this seat, earned through my own effort and resilience. The meeting began, and I shifted into professional mode, focusing on the agenda, leading the discussion, asking pointed questions, demonstrating the competence and strategic thinking that had brought me here. From time to time I would catch a glimpse of my son, still looking stunned, watching me with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. The unspoken conversation between us was louder than any words spoken in the room. This was the answer to his dismissal. This was the quiet, powerful reply to being called embarrassing. And it was delivered not with anger or vengeance, but with quiet competence and undeniable authority. The meeting proceeded, a surreal experience with my son sitting there, mute and visibly shaken, while I led discussions on corporate strategy and financial projections. I maintained my professional demeanor, addressing others around the table, making eye contact, guiding the conversation. But I was acutely aware of his presence, the weight of his gaze. When it was his turn to speak, to present his team's update, his voice was hesitant, a stark contrast to his usual confident, sometimes arrogant tone. He stumbled over his words, his usual polish completely gone. He avoided looking at me directly, addressing his remarks mostly to David Miller. It was clear he was struggling to process the reality of the situation. David Miller, a seasoned professional, seemed to grasp the awkwardness and tried to smooth things over, occasionally jumping in to clarify points or offer support to my son's presentation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man my son complained about was in this moment trying to help him navigate a situation created by my unexpected presence. When the meeting concluded, people gathered their things, exchanging polite pleasantries. My son remained seated for a moment, as if rooted to the spot. David Miller excused himself, giving my son a brief, unreadable look before leaving the room. As the others filtered out, I gathered my papers, deliberately taking my time. My son finally stood up, approaching the table hesitantly. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, his eyes searching mine, a mixture of confusion, awe, and something that might have been shame swirling within them. "Mom?" he finally said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. It was the first time he had used that tone with me in years, stripped of the casual dismissiveness, the underlying impatience. What are you doing here?" I met his gaze directly, my own expression calm, composed. "I work here now," I said simply. "As you heard." "But, Senior Vice President?" He shook his head, as if unable to reconcile the title with a woman he had labeled embarrassing. "How? When did this happen?" "I started last week," I said. "I've been working towards something like this for a while now." I didn't elaborate, didn't mention his words, the pain, the years of quiet effort. This wasn't the time for that conversation. Not here, not now. He ran a hand through his hair, looking bewildered. "But you never said anything. You never asked," I replied, the quiet truth hanging between us. He flinched slightly at that, the implication clear. He hadn't been interested enough to ask. "So, David Miller, he reports, through someone to you," he stammered, the corporate hierarchy he navigated, every day, suddenly taking on a deeply personal, uncomfortable dimension. "Yes," I confirmed. "That's correct. Your reporting line is now rather interesting." A wry, bittersweet smile touched my lips. This wasn't about gloating, but acknowledging the stark reality of the power inversion, the sheer undeniable irony of the situation. He seemed unable to form a coherent sentence, his carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The woman he had relegated to the background, the one whose presence he found embarrassing, was now a figure of authority in his professional life, a figure who could potentially influence his own career path. The realization seemed to hit him with full force. Does Sarah know?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I hadn't told Sarah either. Our relationship was even more superficial than mine with him. "Not from me," I said. He paled further, likely imagining his wife's reaction to this seismic shift, this disruption to their carefully managed image. I watched him, this man who was my son, the boy I had loved fiercely, now standing before me as a stranger, stripped of his usual composure, facing the consequences of his own dismissiveness. There was no triumph in his discomfort, only a profound sadness for the years of distance, the emotional chasm that had opened between us. The initial surge of vindication had passed, replaced by a complex wave of emotions. I had achieved my goal. Yes, I had reclaimed my power, redefined myself, proven that I was far from embarrassing. But the cost felt suddenly heavy. The broken connection with my son, the years of unspoken resentment and misunderstanding, lay bare between us. This corporate victory, significant as it was, couldn't magically heal those wounds. It could only, perhaps, force a reckoning. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words and years of accumulated distance. He stood there, the high-flying corporate executive, looking like a lost boy. The facade of confidence he usually wore had crumbled, replaced by a raw vulnerability that was both familiar and jarring. I saw a flicker of the child he once was in his eyes, before the world, and perhaps his wife, had taught him to value polish over authenticity, image over connection. "Mom," he started again, his voice still low, hesitant. I don't know what to say. There's nothing you need to say right now," I replied gently, gathering the last of my papers. I wasn't going to force a confession, an apology. Any attempt at reconciliation had to come from him, genuinely, not born out of shock or professional necessity. "We can talk later if you like. When you've had a chance to process this?" He nodded, numbly, still looking stunned. Yeah, okay. Later. Definitely." He took a small step back, as if needing space to breathe, to regain his equilibrium. "I should go. I have things." "Of course," I said, offering a small, sad smile. "It was interesting seeing you here." That was an understatement. It was a moment I had, in a way, orchestrated, but its reality was more complex, more emotionally charged than I had anticipated. He mumbled something inarticulate and retreated, almost stumbling in his haste to leave the room. I watched him go, a lump forming in my throat. The triumph of the moment was bittersweet, laced with the pain of our fractured relationship. I had achieved my goal, reached the summit I had set my sights on, but I stood there alone. The view from the top breathtaking, but also strangely empty. The next few weeks were a blur of work. I immersed myself in my new role, tackling complex strategic challenges, leading my team, proving my capabilities over and over again. I was good at this. The years of managing a household, juggling multiple demands, making difficult decisions with limited resources, had honed a pragmatic, strategic mind that was well suited to the corporate world. The quiet strength I had relied on in my personal life translated into a calm authority in the boardroom. I was respected, my opinions valued. It was a stark contrast to feeling unseen, unheard. In my own family, my son avoided me. I would occasionally see him in the hallways, or across the vast company cafeteria, but he would quickly look away or duck into a side office. He didn't return my casual nods. It was clear he was still struggling to come to terms with my presence, my position. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically, so unexpectedly, that he didn't know how to interact with me anymore. He couldn't treat me with the casual dismissal he had perfected over the years, not when I held this level of authority, but he also seemed unable to bridge the gap, to acknowledge the years of neglect, the hurtful words that had driven me to this point. Sarah called me a few days after the meeting. Her voice was tight, strained, lacking its usual smooth confidence. "So," she began, without preamble, "I hear you're working at Sterling and Shaw, in a rather senior role." There was no warmth, no congratulation, only thinly veiled suspicion and resentment. "That's right, Sarah," I said calmly. "Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy." I let the title hang in the air. "Right," she said, a sharp edge to her voice. "Quite a leap from what you were doing before. Surprising." The implication was clear. How did someone like you end up there? "Perhaps I had more potential than you realized," I responded, my voice polite but firm. She scoffed softly. "Potential? After 20 years out of the game? It's just very sudden and rather unexpected, especially for Son's name. It puts him in a bit of a strange position." Her concern wasn't for me, or even for him, but for how this affected their carefully constructed image. their professional trajectory. It was always about them, about appearances, about what other people thought. His position is his to navigate, I said. My career path is independent of his. Right, she repeated, the skepticism thick in her tone. Well, it's certainly something to get used to. She didn't say embarrassing this time, but the sentiment lingered in the pregnant pauses, the clipped words. The conversation was short, stilted. She was clearly uncomfortable, her usual manipulative charm failing her in the face of this undeniable reality. I hung up, feeling a familiar weariness, their inability to see beyond their own narrow perspective, to acknowledge my achievements on their own merit, was disheartening, but no longer surprising. They were trapped in their judgment of who they thought I was, unable or unwilling to see who I had become. My office, with its panoramic view and quiet efficiency, felt like a sanctuary. Here, I was defined by my actions, my intellect, my contributions, not by outdated perceptions or hurtful labels. The painful irony was that achieving this freedom, this validation, had cost me the easy familiarity of my family relationships. But perhaps I thought, looking out at the city lights twinkling below, that familiarity had always been conditional, built on a foundation of being less than, of being someone who didn't rock the boat, who didn't challenge their expectations, and I was done being that person. The quiet strength that had guided me here was now a settled, unshakable power, not over others, but within myself. Weeks turned into months. I settled fully into my role as senior vice president. I restructured my department, launched new initiatives, and contributed significantly to the firm's strategic direction. I traveled for work, attended conferences, met with clients and partners. My life, once centered around the rhythms of home and family, was now a whirlwind of professional activity and intellectual challenge. I thrived in this environment, discovering reserves of energy and capability I hadn't known I possessed. My son and I had not had the talk I had offered that day in the conference room. He continued to avoid me, a silent, awkward presence in the periphery of my corporate life. He would sometimes be in meetings I chaired, and while he was now more professional, more composed, there was still a palpable tension radiating from him. He would address me as my title, maintaining a formal distance. It was clear he still didn't know how to be around me, how to reconcile the embarrassing mother with the senior vice president. David Miller, his boss, was respectful, professional. He clearly understood the delicate dynamic, though we never spoke of it directly. He treated me as his superior, seeking my input, keeping me informed. He seemed in his own way to be navigating the awkwardness by adhering strictly to the corporate protocol. Sarah made no further attempts at contact. Our brief, strained conversation seemed to have solidified her discomfort. Perhaps she couldn't bear the reality of the embarrassing mother holding a position of power higher than her husband's, higher than she had likely ever imagined for me. The house felt increasingly like just a place I slept, a quiet echo of a life that was no longer my primary focus. The den, once the center of my quiet transformation, now felt almost like a museum exhibit. The stack of old textbooks, the worn armchair, the photos of a past self, and a past relationship with my son. I still looked at the photos, but the sharp ache had dulled, replaced by a reflective sadness. I hadn't set out for revenge, but for reclamation. I had achieved that beyond my wildest expectations. I had proved my worth, not just to him, but to myself in the most undeniable way possible. I was no longer defined by his judgment, by the roles I had played for others. I was defined by my own capabilities, my own achievements, my own quiet power. One evening, working late in my office, I received an email. It was from my son. The subject line was simply, "Can we talk?" My heart gave a small jolt. This was it, the conversation I had been waiting for, dreading, and in a strange way, hoping for. I replied simply, "Yes. Are you free this weekend?" He responded quickly, "Saturday? Your place?" "Saturday it is." I confirmed. The few days leading up to Saturday were tense. I didn't know what he would say, how he would approach it. Would he apologize? Would he be angry? Would he still be defensive? I prepared myself for anything, steeling myself against potential hurt. reminding myself of the strength I had found, the distance I had traveled. Saturday arrived. A crisp autumn afternoon. I cleaned the house, baked a simple cake, made coffee. It felt strangely like preparing for a visit from a polite acquaintance. Not my own son. He arrived on time, ringing the doorbell instead of walking in like he used to. Another small symbol of the distance between us. I opened the door, and he stood there, looking nervous, holding a small bunch of flowers. It was the first time he had brought me flowers in years. "Hi, Mom," he said softly, offering the flowers. "Can I come in?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside. He walked into the house, looking around as if seeing it for the first time in a long time. He didn't make small talk as he handed me the flowers. We sat in the living room, the setting for countless family gatherings, holidays, and now this awkward, crucial conversation. The air was thick with unspoken history. He fidgeted for a moment, staring down at his hands clasped between his knees. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw the vulnerability I had glimpsed that day in the conference room. "Mom," he began, his voice a little shaky. I need to apologize for what I said at the company picnic." The words were difficult for him. Clearly, he wasn't used to admitting fault, especially not to me. "Calling you embarrassing. It was cruel, and it was wrong." He paused, taking a deep breath. I was an idiot, focused on the wrong things, trying to fit in, I guess, to look the part for Sarah, for my colleagues. He ran a hand over his face. "It doesn't excuse it. Nothing does. Those words, they were awful. And seeing you at work, in that position, it made me realize how incredibly wrong I was. How much I underestimated you. How little I actually knew about you, about who you are." The apology was raw, heartfelt. It wasn't just about the words, but about the years of dismissiveness they represented. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring his image. It wasn't relief exactly, or even forgiveness. Not yet. It was the sudden release of years of pain, the acknowledgement of a wound that had festered in silence. "It hurt," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "More than you know, to hear that from you, after everything." "I know," he said, his own eyes glistening. "And I'm so sorry." We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the past hanging between us, but also the fragile possibility of a future. "When you said that," I continued, finding my voice, "it was like a wake-up call. It made me look at my life, at how I had let myself fade into the background, how I had let others define my worth." I looked at him. "You calling me embarrassing? It was the catalyst. It pushed me to do something I had always wanted to do, but was afraid to reclaim my own identity, my own ambition." He looked up surprised. "So, that's why you went back to work, because of what I said?" "That's part of it," I admitted. "A big part. But it was also about me, about proving to myself that I was still capable, that I was more than just a mother, a homemaker, that I was still the woman who had dreams before life took a different turn." He was silent for a moment, absorbing this. "I had no idea," he said softly. "You seemed content." "Appearances can be deceiving," I said, thinking of the carefully constructed facades he and Sarah presented to the world. "I was content with being your mother, with raising you. I never regretted that." A small, sad smile touched my lips. "But maybe I lost myself a little in the process." "And now?" he asked, looking at me, really looking at me, perhaps for the first time in years. "Now," I said, standing up and walking to the window, looking out at the autumn leaves falling gently in the yard. "Now I am Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy at Sterling & Shaw." I turned back to him. "And I am not embarrassed by who I am. Not anymore." The empowerment wasn't about having power over him, but about the power I had found within myself. It was about reclaiming my narrative, owning my story. The conversation that followed was long, difficult, and necessary. We talked about the years of distance, The misunderstandings, the unspoken resentments. There were tears, uncomfortable truths, and moments of raw honesty. He spoke about the pressures he felt, the expectations from Sarah, from his career. I spoke about feeling unseen, undervalued, the quiet ache of watching him drift away. It wasn't a magical fix, a sudden erase of the past. The wounds were still there, the scars visible, but the conversation was a beginning, a tentative step towards understanding, towards rebuilding something that had been broken. The air felt lighter after the conversation, though the emotional weight of it lingered. We spent the rest of the afternoon in a quiet truce, a tentative rediscovery of each other. He asked me about my work, genuinely curious this time, listening with interest as I described the challenges and rewards of my new role. I asked him about his team, his projects, listening not as his mother who might find things embarrassing, but as a colleague, a fellow professional. There was a newfound respect in his questions, in the way he listened, a recognition of my competence that had been absent before. He saw me now not just as mom, but as my name, Senior Vice President. It was a strange duality, but perhaps a necessary one for now. It allowed us to connect on a different level, one where the old dynamics of dismissal and disappointment didn't immediately surface. He left that evening with another apology, a hug that felt more genuine than any we had shared in years, and a promise to talk again soon, not just out of obligation, but because we wanted to. The path to healing, to rebuilding our relationship, stretched before us, long and uncertain. There were no guarantees. The years of distance and misunderstanding couldn't be erased overnight. Sarah remained a complication, her subtle antagonism a lingering presence. But a door had opened, a possibility created. My journey had started from a place of deep hurt and public humiliation. It had led me through years of quiet struggle, relentless self-improvement, and ultimately to a position of significant power and influence in the very world where I had been deemed unfit. The irony was profound, the victory undeniably sweet. But the true victory wasn't in the job title or the corner office. It was in the reclaiming of my own voice, my own strength, my own identity. It was in proving to myself that I was resilient, capable, and worthy of respect, regardless of anyone else's opinion. The embarrassing mother had transformed, not into someone seeking revenge, but into someone empowered, standing tall in her own right. My relationship with my son remained complex, a work in progress. We continued to talk, cautiously navigating the new landscape of our connection. There were still moments of awkwardness, reminders of the past hurts, but there were also moments of genuine connection, shared laughter, and a growing mutual respect. He saw me now, not just for the role I played in his life, but for the person I was, the professional I had become. And in turn I saw him with new eyes, not just as the son who had hurt me, but as a flawed, complicated human being, capable of growth and change. The story wasn't over. Life rarely offers neat, tidy endings, but the most dramatic, tense chapters had closed. I had faced the betrayal, transformed the resignation into resolve, and achieved a bittersweet form of empowerment. The dark beginning had led, not to a fairy tale resolution, but to a redemptive truth. I was the architect of my own worth. The house still stood, a silent witness to the years of quiet sacrifice, and the dramatic shift that had taken place within its walls and within me. It was no longer a museum of a past life, but simply a house, filled with the echoes of who I had been, and the quiet confidence of who I had become. My career at Sterling and Shaw thrived. I was good at my job, respected by my peers and superiors. My experience, far from being a liability, offered a unique perspective, a blend of seasoned wisdom and newfound corporate acumen. I was a leader, a strategist, a valuable asset to the firm. And sometimes in meetings I would look across the table at my son, now no longer avoiding my gaze, watching me with a quiet intensity, perhaps still processing the profound shift in our relationship. And I would remember his words, "It's just embarrassing," and a quiet, powerful smile would touch my lips. Not out of triumph over him, but out of gratitude to him, for unintentionally pushing me towards the most important journey of my life, the journey back to myself.